Well, this was about how we policymakers use scientific evidence when we're making our decisions. And I think you'll find that most politicians will tell you that they're evidence-based, that they use scientific data before they come to a conclusion on a subject. So this was really about, well, how do we do that? And is it adequate? Do we have the systems in place that mean people have got the evidence? And it's fascinating because clearly there are many different views on this. Well, one of the things that we discussed, so yes, I would still say most will tell you that, but of course then you have to ask them, well, what evidence do you look at? Where do you get it from? Most of us have confirmation bias, so we look for evidence that supports our own opinions. If we don't have an opinion, then maybe we're a little bit more open-minded and but we still are looking for things which are easily accessible or that are put in front of us. What's put in front of us is often comes from, maybe from advocacy groups or companies or whatever, and so you have to recognise that that might be not so much bias but partial. It's a very big difference. So what we've been discussing today is, well, how can we get more evidence? How can we maybe get better summaries of evidence so that we can perhaps cut some of that out? We also talked a bit about not just risk, but risk and hazard, and that argument, which rages all the time in Europe. If something is known to be hazardous to health, should it be banned automatically, or do we need to look at its exposure and therefore safe levels of use? And frankly, people have different opinions on that. I'm strongly in the camp of risk, but many colleagues are strongly in the camp of hazard. So how do we reconcile that and come up with good policy? Well, we rely very heavily on the legislation, and the legislation points us in different directions. So if you're looking at plant protection products, then you're very much pointed towards ECHA. If you're looking at food, it's towards EFSA, but they're based on different principles. So in ECHA, we have things like the CLP, and in EFSA we have a much looser, I think, set of regulations around food. Not looser in the sense they're less safe, but that the agency has a lot more, in my view, latitude. So first thing is, we're not consistent. We're not consistent across legislation and across different areas on how we deal with data. So I'd like to see more consistency. Then we have at the higher level, at Commission level, the setting up of this scientific advice mechanism, which is not been around for very long. It's done a few high-level reports, which I've found very interesting, and I know that they're inputting into the very early levels of policy development at the Commission. They don't really help me as a legislator. I don't find them particularly useful. Partly, I haven't really been involved in legislation on any of the things that they've looked at. So whilst I think that is a great initiative, I don't think that it's going to help the everyday jobbing MEP when we're faced with amendments on a piece of legislation. And then we also talked a little bit about STOA and the European Parliamentary Research. And again, I don't think that those are strongly enough integrated into our decision-making processes, and I'd like to see STOA particularly, on which the European Parliament spends a fair amount of money, becoming more relevant to the actual policy agenda, not the future, which I think they do very well, looking at things in the future, but what's happening today and what are we making decisions on today and how can they help members? Well, what I've concluded is that we need to react more to the modern world that we're living in. So people have information, not huge amounts of information, but they have pieces of information that they find it difficult to piece together into the full jigsaw. So I think we need to think about a much more rounded approach to information. I'd like to see European agencies being able to lift their heads from the very rigorous restrictions that the legislation places on them and look a bit more in the round. So, for example, I'd like to look at risk-benefit. It's not just about risk management. It's about, well, okay, if you manage the risk of this, but what might it do to something else? What might the knock-on be? And we don't do that at all. So I think that's a really clear view that we should start looking at that. Absolutely, and I think the example I used was on the banning of neonicotinoids, which there is some evidence, mostly lab evidence, but there is some field trial evidence that they're dangerous to bees. So precautionary limit was taken so that they were banned. Well, that's fine. I was very against it because my view was, well, what are we going to have to do instead? Because farmers will simply spray something else, and that something else, yes, has been through. It's safe, but it's only safe to be used in a certain way. It's not been at the moment. It's not used on those particular products. So open spraying maybe 5 times on a crop of a different type of chemical, we have effectively said is preferable to a seed treatment once. But that comparison was never made. That was never looked at. So how can we be so sure that it's such a good idea to ban neonicotinoids? And that's been my objection to it all along. I'd like to see us do something about that. I think there should be a full study of what will happen if something is banned. And glyphosate is a very good example of that, where we have many people who'd like to ban glyphosate almost completely. Well, okay, but if you do, what will happen? And we should be weighing up the benefits and the risks across the board.